Welcome to the SSI Orbit podcast, a forum for conversations that explore the ever-growing ecosystems of self-sovereign identity. And I'm your host, Mathieu Glaude. Today's conversation is with Timo Glastra, one of the three founders at Animo Solutions, a Dutch-based software development company that consumes and also contributes to open-source decentralized ID projects, with the aim to place people in control of their own digital interactions. Now, during this podcast, we try to answer the question, why are governments choosing Hyperledger? To do so, Timo helps us understand it by initially describing the emerging open data standards that lay the foundation for self-sovereign identity. We then discuss the open source technology projects, notably Hyperledger Aries and Hyperledger Indy, to then talk about how the standards on one side and the tech on another interact with each other to achieve interoperability, and what some of the challenges and advancements look like in the area of interoperability. And also, having worked on a lot of open source projects, Timo gives his opinion on why the Hyperledger Aries framework JavaScript is a Swiss Army knife for modern SSI. So now, without any further ado, here's my conversation with Timo on why are governments choosing Hyperledger. Enjoy. Timo, the SSI space overall is still kind of in an early stage. And while many standards are emerging in the space, it's important to understand that in the early days of all the industries, specifications and standards quickly change. So we got to kind of keep up with that. But as kind of an opener here, and just to kind of break down, I think it'll be interesting for the listeners here if we're able through this conversation to break down kind of the open standards that are being developed and used, the open technology standards that are being developed and used, how they kind of work together. I think will shed a lot of clarity to people that have trouble kind of figuring out all the different pieces in the space. So I'd like to just open the conversation talking about the open standards. What are some of the open standards? And they could come from W3C or other organizations, but what are these kind of building blocks that kicked off the whole space some years ago?
Yeah, sure. I think if you have like the two most foundational ones, I think you have the DID standard, decentralized identifier standard, and the Verifiable Credential standard, which together they are a really powerful way to have data, have signatures on it, and prove things about certain data. There's that's for verified credentials, and then the decentralized identifiers allow to couple either an entity, an organization, or someone to that specific credential. So you can say who issued it and what it comes from. And those two things, I think, are the foundation of what people working in this space are all building on top of. And not everybody is like strictly adhering to these standards now or have like variants on these standards. I think Indy is a very notable one in that it has a lot of the things that verified credentials and decentralized identifiers offer, but they don't have the spec implemented yet. And I think that's mainly because they started working on it before there were any of those standards. So, and I think a lot of those standards evolved from like these projects that started out.
So if we go a little deeper into both of those, you mentioned the DID standard and the verifiable credential standard. If we just start with the DID standard, it is explaining the standard. It's just allowing people to connect to each other or message or exchange credentials between each other in some way. And kind of what's the difference between a DID and just a classic kind of public private key type of approach?
Yeah, I think a DID is a data model, and it allows you to assign a DID document to a decentralized identifier, and that allows you to specify keys that can be used for signing things, for encrypting things. And so the difference with just a static key is that DIDs allows rotation of keys, and also one of the things that DIDs try to offer is that you can create and manage these things without interference of any other party. So I could create my own DID and I could, once that really takes off, I could provide other parties my DID, and they can then make claims about that DID and give them back to me, and I can later share those claims about. But that means I have like my own identifier that I control. So I don't have to be reliant on online services to provide me with an account or something, which if they see fit can remove, and then I lost my account. This is like really under my control, which also, it gives extra responsibility because you need to manage those DIDs. And I think there's still a lot of things we need to do to make it easy for people to manage those, because if you lose them, they're lost forever. You're not relying on external services to do that, but it will, it gives a lot of control to you. And even if like everything, all services go down or something, you will still be able to prove you are the owner of that DID, which can be really valuable in cases.
And then the DIDs are able to interact with the other kind of data standard, the verifiable credential data standard. There is, I think, a lot of people have been quite excited now over the past little while about verifiable credentials. I think a lot of companies that are in the traditional digital identity space, funny to call it traditional, I think it still has a lot of room for growth. It's still immature, but a lot of people are getting into the verifiable credential space, seeing that there's kind of a lot of utility for that. So does the verifiable credential standard out of the W3C, does it have some of these same properties that you described for the decentralized identifiers? And kind of, could you go a little deeper into what goes into this data standard?
Yeah, you mean like the in-verified credentials?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So I think the VC spec, I think DIDs are came as when the verified credential spec was being created. I think the DID spec was something that was not first planned, but something that was needed when creating the verified credential spec, because it's very different things, like claiming something about a subject and actually identifying who that subject is. I think verified credentials are really, it allows you to say anything about anything, which is very broad, and you don't have very specific use case for it, but there's so much things we need to verify, and all those things are on paper nowadays, or are behind very complex systems that you don't see how it works. And verified credentials allow you to have a portable container with data and be able to prove anything you want about that data. And I think that's it's a shift in how it works, because at the moment, if you want to verify things through another party, they mostly need to interact with the other party themselves to be able to verify the data. And with verified credentials, you can take that data yourself and show it to others and say, yeah, this is actually what they said. And so you don't need the other party anymore. So a lot like how you have the things in your wallet nowadays, where I have like an ID card that I can show to anyone, and they're like, oh yeah, that's what the government said. And it's just a digital representation of what we have physical nowadays.
Could both of these decentralized identifier and verifiable credentials be used independently from each other, or do they kind of have to go together? Because I sense that a lot of people are excited about verifiable credentials and claim support for verifiable credentials, but maybe don't really support the whole DID spec or DID standard.
Yeah, you can definitely use them separately. I think DIDs is just some way to prove you own that certain identifier, which can be used for everything. You can use it for website authentication or whatever. And you don't necessarily need verified credentials for that. The same as you can use verified credentials without DIDs. But I think using DIDs without verified credentials is more common than the other way around, because you need some way to tie that verified credential to an identifier. And DIDs are a really good way to do that without relying on otherwise you would need to tie it to a specific a public key that's hosted somewhere. You basically have a less powerful variant of the DID.
Awesome. So now if we take these standards that we've defined here, now the next step is how do we put these to action, right? So how do we take these standards now and allow people to create these identities about themselves and start making claims about certain identities and communicating with each other? How, at a high level, and we'll go a little deeper into the tech stack throughout this conversation, but at a high level now, how do I take these and start to use these? What are some of the technologies or protocols that enable us to do that?
Yeah, sure. I think by default, if you only have DIDs and verified credentials, you're already you already have quite a lot that you need, because I just need to put a signature on it with some of the keys that are in my DID document, and I can share it with you, and then others are able to verify it. But in practice, you also want something to be able to exchange these credentials in a secure way. So it becomes easier to manage. And I think there are, a lot of ways to do that. And I think there's less, I think there's still more discussion about like, how do we exchange these things? And we work a lot with Hyperledger Aries, which uses DITCOM, which is like a secure protocol that you can use for credentials, but a whole other lot of things. It's like a secure communication channel. But there are also other approaches under the W3C that are more like HTTP based with the normal way how we handle request response type of interactions. My preference goes more to the DITCOM, because it's built on top of this new DID way of controlling things and how you securely communicate with each other.
Is a major difference between the HTTP based and Aries based? It's kind of like comparing an API based approach to just a secure, like just a peer-to-peer over a protocol approach. Like, is that the key difference?
Yeah, I think so. The DITCOM in this case, it's transport agnostic, so you don't have to use HTTP or WebSocket. You could use Bluetooth, you could use NFC, which is like, if we're thinking about exchanging the credentials, there are so many cases in how that could happen. I could be physically present somewhere. Now then, using either Bluetooth or NFC could be really convenient, especially if you're in areas without internet connections. So then you're not binding it to the traditional HTTP interactions. I think for using, if you're on a website and you want to interact with it, then you're also already using HTTP. And it's good. So I think it's just a more foundational thing that allows a lot more interactions in different ways than something like a strict HTTP interaction.
How a lot of national digital ID programs that are being driven by different governments, if we look in the EU or if we look in Canada, are really choosing the Hyperledger stack, right? They're using Aries, they're using Indy for their networks. Could you explain a little bit more, and just taking back some of these standards that we use, could you shed a bit of light on kind of how Aries and Indy are working together and how they're working together with these standards, right? So how they work together, and then just to help us try to understand, like, why are the governments choosing this stack over another one?
Yeah, sure. I think what the difference, like what Indy does, is Indy provides the ledger where you can anchor your DIDs and you can anchor other information that you need. So for example, revocation status. And Hyperledger Aries is more the layer on top that provides the communication protocols. And so if I created a credential for this citizen, how do I get it to this citizen? And that's where Hyperledger Aries can help you and securely send the credential over a peer-to-peer channel. And I think why people or governments are really choosing Hyperledger is to me, it provides an end-to-end solution. Whereas I think some of the other things that are being developed are really, they tackle a single thing. And I think for like the greater interoperability and adoption of things, yeah, you can't enforce a single thing, like you need to use these standards exactly, and then you can use it, because people have different use cases where if something doesn't work about that specific standard, then you're out. You need to look at new things, and combining all these separate lower level things allows you to be more flexible, but also makes it a lot harder to, I think, get started with this, because if you don't have an end-to-end solution, you need to really know, all right, what are the different components, which components do I need for which specific use case, why do I need to choose this one over the other? And for Hyperledger Aries, at least for me, is when you get started, is all right, this is the credential type you use, this is the communication protocol you use. There are some open source implementations that allow you to do this end-to-end when you get started. And I think, it's opening a lot more to these new standards, but I think the whole end-to-end flow that's being used by a lot of people, which means you have a lot easier, I think, interoperability from the start, because you're all using the same base to work off.
I guess the other good thing that if we just take Indy as that public identity utility on that bottom layer to store different information about issuers or about revocation. I guess the good thing about these types of networks too is that they are public readable, but they're permissioned. The governance is permissioned, right? Which it makes sense for governments, right? That if they're building their own trust network, that they're able to kind of build it under the governance that they're looking to do there. And Indy is the only use case it's been built for is for identity, right? As well, so it's very specific to that. Could you work with other ledgers though, like with Aries? Is it dependent on Indy? Does it just work better with Indy? And then there's also Hyperledger Ursa, right? Which is another project that's in the whole stack here.
Yeah. Ursa is like the lower level crypto library that was first part of Indy, but later extracted because it could be useful for other projects or things. And that provides the lower level crypto that Indy and Aries needs to be able to securely communicate, to sign credentials, to do very complex mathematical things with zero knowledge proofs and selective disclosure or privacy preserving revocation. So it's really a foundation that Indy and Aries are built on top. But you can use it without Ursa. For example, there's an implementation of Aries Framework Go that doesn't depend on Hyperledger Ursa at all, because in the end, crypto should also be like, it should be a standard, and it should describe how it should work, and you should be able to make another implementation in another language. And I think you could use Hyperledger Aries with other ledgers than Indy. And I think there's a lot of work going on at the moment. It's just that Aries was also a project that came out of Indy, where they realized, all right, we now are building all these things on top of Hyperledger Indy to be able to exchange these credentials, issue credentials, verify credentials. But those are like concepts that are also usable with other ledgers than Indy ledgers. But that's, I think, from the start, it has been mostly Indy ledgers that work with Hyperledger Aries. And I think that's also an assumption that a lot of people have made for a long time, that, Hyperledger Aries, that only works with Hyperledger Indy. And I think that also was kind of the case, but there's a lot of work going on to make it work with other ledger types. Aries Framework Go has never supported Indy and just started working with Hyperledger Aries and started adopting the W3C specs from the start. Aries Cloud Agent Python, another implementation, is also has recently started supporting W3C credentials with BBS Plus signatures. Now also supports like the W3C DIT spec. So a lot of work going towards supporting other DIT methods, which also means you need to support other ledger types. Yeah.
You wrote an article recently on Medium, and we'll link it in the show notes, coming up from Animo Solutions, company you're founder and a part of. You wrote an article entitled Aries Framework JavaScript, the Swiss Army knife for modern SSI development. Why do you think Aries Framework JavaScript is the Swiss Army knife for modern SSI development?
Yeah, sure. I think because it provides a lot of tools out of the box that you need to build SSI solutions. And that's really what we want to achieve with Aries Framework JavaScript, is that even though you are not very familiar with SSI, it provides everything you need to start building SSI solutions on top of it. And so the goal is to make a very easy API that you can use to just, if you need to make a connection, issue a credential and verify a proof, it should only take about 3 API calls to do that action. And we try to abstract away a lot of the complexities. And it has a few features, I think, that are really useful when you start building SSI solutions. So we wrote it in JavaScript, which is, for I think a lot of people, not the first language they will go to for this kind of SSI related frameworks. But it's because it's cross-platform in JavaScript, we can use it in mobile wallets. So we use it to build wallets cross-platform for iOS and Android, but we can also use it server-side for Node.js, which is really powerful, where we now notice in a few projects we're working on, we need to build custom protocols, for example, and we can just do it once and it will work across server-side, mobile side. So yeah, you are not creating the 3 different implementations of everything. And another thing is that JavaScript is a very popular language. And that means that it will be a lot easier for people to start working with it and also start extending it for their specific use cases. Where I think Rust is a very, like a lot of things are written in Rust on the lower level, which I think is, it's good for a whole lot of reasons, but it's not very accessible, I think, to get started with it. So we think by writing it in a language that people understand, it will be easier for them to start looking through the code, start working with it, and extending it themselves. Yeah, so that's, I think, a few of these things is what makes it like what we call the Swiss Army knife. But it's still, I think, really a vision that we are working towards because there's still a lot of work to do. And I think over the next months we will spend a lot of time to make sure the framework gets better, gets extended with new features. But yeah, that's just what we're trying to work towards. Like, you just install it, you start playing with it, and in a matter of seconds you have like your first end-to-end flow set up where you issue credentials and can verify credentials.
What excites me a lot about this, you mentioned API calls just to make it easier for someone to just integrate to get going. But once you get going, it's just that one integration, right? It's like after you've done that one integration and now you're using Aries, you could just step into this peer-to-peer protocol mode where it's going to be a significant disruption once this stuff starts to propagate and get adopted a little more within the enterprises. And I think about this a lot, like just the amount of process that companies have in place, and they're probably more efficient than they ever were now, but just to integrate an API product from an external source, it's a big process on its own. But if you have this agent technology in place, like you're open now for peer-to-peer communication. Someone could just come into your network and start consuming or start talking. If there's a new service provider that wants to start issuing credentials or offering services, they could kind of just come in. It's just a big change in mentality of how things are done today, right?
Yeah, definitely. And this is just like it's now Aries and JavaScript, and or just the Aries is it doesn't have to be only for credentials. I think this can be used for a whole lot of other things going forward, because if you have a secure peer-to-peer communication channel, you can use that for anything, where you have a lot more flexibility in how things interact. So I think credentials is a good start, but yeah, you can use it for a lot of online interactions.
Well, it would be silly if I didn't ask you this question now. Then, outside of credentials, what are some of the use cases that you think are exciting? Like peer-to-peer messaging just seems like one thing on its own. Are there other things that excite you?
Yeah, I think peer-to-peer messaging is a good example. I think another one that I'm very excited about, that you go a bit less about very specific DITCOM, but if you think about identity hubs, where a lot of talk is about, like having your own instance that people can communicate with, that you control, and where people store data in your hub and interact with it. So you don't rely on a lot of external services, but external services integrate with you. I think that is like the long-term thing that I'm really excited about, is that you get a bit more control in how things work. In like the most thing I'm always so angry about is that I once upgraded my free Google account to a paid Google account, and you can't downgrade your account. So that means you have to close your account, but that means that everything you once shared with anyone will be lost. So I'm now stuck basically to paying Google till I die, or like making backups and making sure that I get that to everyone, because I shared a lot of photos with people, because yeah, it's the easiest tool to do that. So if I have something that I could control to do that, and yeah, I would be happy to pay for such things. That I think that would be like really amazing.
Well, I think the Google clause at the beginning, like their quote of "Don't be evil," I think they actually removed that, so they got you there for sure.
Yeah.
So there's a lot, obviously, of national programs, like I said, going on using the Hyperledger stack. There's stuff happening in Germany. There's stuff now happening in Spain. On the recent episode of the SSI podcast, I spoke to a policy expert, Sebastian Manhart, who works for the German Chancellery, and there's so much exciting stuff happening in that space using this Hyperledger stack, which is exciting. So some of the concerns I hear for some people is that people are concerned that the way people are deploying Indy networks, like in these countries in Europe or in Canada, like British Columbia and in Ontario, some people are concerned about the compliance of the Indy networks to W3C standards. Is this a right concern for these people to have? How would you kind of go about explaining that to them?
Yeah, sure. I think it's a valid concern, in the sense that Indy hasn't very good W3C compliance yet. Mainly, I think because they were so early, and if you are early, it's always harder to catch up, because if you start out when just the new shiny spec came out, of course you will start building with that. But if you already have like an ecosystem of people that depend on these things, it becomes a lot harder to adopt these new standards, and also a lot harder to justify adopting these new standards, because you're like, yeah, we have something working right now, right? So yeah, I think it's a valid concern, but there has been a lot of work going on in the space to move towards W3C compliance. There's, for example, a DIT Indy spec that has been completely written, that is ready to be implemented right now. It isn't implemented yet, but that adheres to the Indy, to the W3C spec. And once that gets implemented, you have like W3C compliance for DITs. So there is progress being made towards this. And I think it will be a lot of work, but it's also, I think with these new standards, I think where Indy provided the whole stack, firstly, I think moving to these W3C standards, it will actually reduce the tasks that, for example, Indy has to do quite a bit, because if we move to W3C standards, you don't need the very specific Indy exchange protocols anymore, because we now have a presentation exchange spec defined under div. And so there, I think a lot of things, also revocation could be a very more generic revocation scheme that can be used by other credential types and ledgers also. So I think that the thing that Indy will focus on going forward is more like really the ledger stuff. That you can use for anchoring DIDs and revocation.
It seems that as the space continues to develop, like some of the stuff has been pulled away from Indy and put into its own project, like Ursa. Aries has kind of become its own thing. So you're starting to get a little more fragmented pieces, but a lot more specialized pieces. Are there concerns for programs that are deploying Indy networks today that it won't be backward compatible as these new Indy specs come out?
Yeah, I think there will definitely be breaking changes, but I think more on a higher level. Like when you interact on an Aries level with Indy credentials, it's not always compliant to the W3C standards. But I think, for example, the most important thing, a ledger, I think they will make sure to make that transition as easy as possible by making sure you can use the old way and the new way, at least for a while. Because if you don't do that, then you just break everything, and I think it will be really hard to catch up to that.
That makes sense, and we see that happen in a lot of new spaces with emerging standards and technologies too. I want to hop over to another subject, which it seems like the hottest word in the self-sovereign identity space, and that is interoperability or interop. We talked about a few things today. I think there's conversations about interoperability on an Aries level. There's conversations about interoperability between Aries and other protocols or methods like the Aries and the HTTP based. I think interoperability is much broader than just the technology anyways. Like you could start going up and talking about interoperability between trust networks and interoperability between public utilities. How can we simplify the interoperability discussion? So I feel like everything just gets kind of bunched into one. It's like interoperability, and that's what people are trying to do. But there's so many layers to that, right? So how do we break that up a little more?
Yeah, I think if you have like the most basic one, I think they always split it up in like technical and governance interoperability, where like you need technical interoperability because if systems don't work together, then yeah, that's just not gonna work. And then I think the other one is like you need to, I think one of the most important aspects is that you at some point need to agree on using the same methods for anything, whether it's technical or governance, because otherwise you won't be able to be interoperable. If you have like a very advanced system and someone else says, no, I want to use this because this doesn't provide this feature, then you can do as much as you want, but you won't get anywhere. So you need to make sure that it tailors everyone's use cases, I think. And I think, I think Aries, for example, does a lot on like it really tries to be the foundation for interoperability on a technical level. And I think there's now a lot of work going on, for example, in the Trust over IP Foundation to make sure we don't only have interoperability on a technical or Aries level, but also like how are we, because at the way I think how mostly these projects are kicked off now is like we have our own ecosystem where we know who the issuers are, who the verifiers are, and like then you can control it and make sure that works together. But then you get all these like different ecosystems that can't work with each other because each defines their own rules. And I think with like the trust registries work that's going on is a really important to enable cross ecosystem interoperability for these projects, because that's at the end what we aim to do here. Not just create our ecosystem that we can work with, but like create cross-border or cross like I don't know, like everything interoperability.
It's awesome to see so many ecosystems or trust networks form. I think that there's certain areas where there's a lot of projects. Like I think the education space on its own, I think people have realized the benefits that could be achieved very quickly by not just digitizing stuff like transcripts and grades and things like that, but actually making it machine readable and consumable. But then that means that there's going to be hundreds and thousands of these ecosystems that are going to pop up everywhere. And you don't necessarily want to have one central source to store all of this stuff. It doesn't make sense. That's why we're doing it in this distributed way, but that they need to be able at some point to open up and talk to each other if we want to kind of have this borderless access and really give accessibility to people and opportunities to people. So when you talk about trust registries, I guess that's more on the governance side of things, right? That if people are implementing these trust registries, it's a governance mechanism that is going to allow cross-ecosystem communication.
Yeah, but it's also like, I'm really, like I always look at things from a very technical side because so I think governance frameworks also, you need to get it right technical because you need a way to like all these rules that people have for different ecosystem or governments or organizations that have, you need to be able to put that in a digital form that anyone can like process and are like, okay, these are the rules, so this is how I should process this. And I think that's also a really complex thing that you want to that needs to be solved, of course.
The governance as code means it becomes technical to some aspect. So we talked about interoperability. Like we have I guess people use this is the Aries agent test harness, or there's now more organizations, and maybe we'll see some governments get into the space as well, where they're going to be doing certifications that you comply with different Aries AIP versions or standards and stuff like that. So that's kind of one thing. And then on the Indy level, there's an interoperability discussion as well. And you had mentioned the DID Indy spec. Is that kind of how you get interoperability on an Indy level? Because there's a lot of different Indy networks today, right? And a lot of them all point to their own specific network. So is it just being able to point to somewhere more generic, or how do we get interoperability now if I have all these education trust ecosystems, they're all running their own Indy network? How can, if a verification is happening cross network, I need to be able to go and read the information that relates to an issuer from another network on another network. So how is that achieved?
Yeah, I think the easy thing about Indy and interoperability is that Indy is only a single implementation, and everyone hosting an Indy network or interacting with an Indy network is using the same implementation. So interoperability is very easy if you only need to interop with yourself, because even if you're not compliant to your own standard, it's still like, you're that on both sides of the interaction. I think with like multiple Indy ledgers, I think there's been a lot of work recently. And now wallets also supporting, for example, the Lazy wallet already supports this feature for a while. I think since last week, the Evernym Connect Me wallet also supports like automatically switching. And at the moment, I think the approach they take for these things is a bit requires a lot of overhead because Indy doesn't yet support the W3C spec, which would very easily allow you to embed into your identifier. Like I'm on the sovereign main net, or I'm on the ID union test network, then you will be able to embed that. And that's currently not possible. So you either need to have your own registry where you know like what belongs to what, or you need to like fetch something from multiple ledgers to see like, hey, where do I get a good result? But that has some security implications again. So I think until we have like a solid W3C compliant identifier standard, it will be it's not a very straightforward process if you don't control like all the ends. If you are have like your closed ecosystem, you could just send something that identifies which ledger to use along with it. But that means if it's not a standard, you're like, it won't be interoperable again.
Yeah, it seems like there's a lot of work that's happening. There's a lot of momentum. Obviously, I think all of the benefits with the Hyperledger stack kind of outweigh the challenges. There's always going to be challenges with new technologies, especially when we're building decentralized governance and decentralized networks. So many things need to be different, but I think we all have confidence in the space that the right things are happening and the right momentum is happening that is really going to enable all of this stuff to come to fruition, not only on just a small ecosystem, but on large national government trust networks as well in the short term. And lots of countries are working on this. We started the conversation by talking about some of these open data standards. We've been talking about the tech standards and how they kind of work together and they work through interoperability. What are some of kind of the newer standards or newer stacks that are coming out that are exciting?
Yeah, I think one of the newer standards is, for example, the presentation exchange that's now hosted under the Decentralized Identity Foundation, which is a very advanced way to request proofs of credentials you want, where you can be really where Indy had some restrictions, I think, in my opinion, in how rich the request could be. Is with the proof request presentation exchange, you can do really rich requests of I want these credentials or these and these. So I think that's a really cool one. And I think some of the standards aren't even that new that we're currently seeking to adopt in Hyperledger Aries, but we just didn't get around to it yet. I think mainly the Verify Credential and the ID spec. One spec that is, I think, really new and a lot of people are already agreeing on that it's a good way forward is PBS credentials, which is like a zero knowledge. It allows for zero knowledge proofs on W3C credentials, which hasn't been around before. It was always like you have Indy credentials or you have W3C credentials, where Indy are privacy preserving and W3C credentials not yet. And I think the addition of this spec will really make it a lot easier for people that are also using Indy to bridge the gap and get to more standards-based solutions.
What's going on in the Netherlands? I know you guys are quite active in that space as well. I know Animo does work globally. You guys are leaders in this deep technology and great team of developers, but specifically in your backyard, what's happening?
We haven't we recently started with doing our first projects in the Netherlands, but for a long time we didn't do a lot of stuff in the Netherlands because all opportunities that came across our path were all like in other countries, mostly American or Canadian projects, but also some other European. I think recently the Dutch government is really looking into it. They've been piloting with SSI for quite a while, but nothing concrete yet. Like where you have the government of British Columbia doing like a lot of work already, and like the things they already produced for with the Von network, or like all the other things they do, like really out in the open. And in the Netherlands, I would say not that much yet. But I think, you have the Dutch Blockchain Coalition here that is now really looking to also set up like a Dutch ecosystem in the SSI space, where they want to launch the Dutch Trust Network, which will be a Dutch Indy based ledger that we can use for our local SSI use cases. And a lot of governmental organizations are partner of the Dutch Blockchain Coalition. So I think having a coalition where you have both government organizations, but also private organizations work together to build an SSI ecosystem, I think that can be really powerful. And nice to see if you could have like an infrastructure that is not government owned or not owned by the private sector, but shared between these different organization types. So I'm really excited to see where that is going. We recently joined the Dutch Blockchain Coalition, so we haven't been a part of it for a long time, but we're really excited to see where that goes and how we can like help make this Dutch Trust Network like take off, and maybe see where our expertise on these topics can also help with that.
Thanks for tuning in today. Hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as I did. To stay up to speed with future episodes, or to catch up on ones you may have missed, make sure to check out the SSI Orbit podcast on your favorite podcast platform, and make sure you subscribe. If you have any questions, comments, or wish to see someone in particular on a future episode, you can find me by searching Mathieu Glaude on LinkedIn or Twitter. Feel free to reach out to me directly and I'll get back to you. See you all next time.